In this video, I want to talk about a couple of ways that you can get a job as a consulting arborist or lateral over to that kind of work. These are the most common ways that I can think of, and there's probably going to be some different options depending on your area. These are not listed in any order of importance. So number one, you can work as an inventory arborist. What that is typically a position with a larger tree company like Davy Resource Group, where you're the person in the field gathering data about individual trees, and then someone higher up will take that information and process it into a report. I'm not exactly sure how it works in larger companies, but I was an inventory arborist for an up and coming smaller company that has now turned corporate. It was my first job out of graduate school, and it was definitely the kind of place where I learned more about the tree care side. The benefits of a position like this is that you're gonna probably get good at tree ID, pest and disease diagnosis, if you're doing some extra research into these things after you're collecting the data, and you start seeing trees and problems that are specific to that species pop up over and over. This assumes that you're actually dedicated and you're not just putting something down on paper, that you're dedicated to researching and figuring out exactly what the issue is. I found that to be really helpful because inventorying massive properties, including municipal inventories, is tedious and fairly mind-numbing because you see the same trees over and over, you see the same problems, and it's when you have that unusual tree or that unusual problem, that's what can be that spark of interest. So what I would do is I would take a ton of pictures, I would go home and I would try to learn as much as possible and figure out what the problem was or what the species was, sometimes down to cultivar. And that helped a lot. It helped break up the monotony of the work, and it really furthered my identification skills. You may be asked to provide more of a summary of issues and observations that you're seeing. Maybe that's in a report format, maybe that's email or some kind of verbal relay of this information to your supervisor. That's almost like consultation. You're sharing with a client who happens to be your manager the things that you're seeing. In the role that I had, I was basically an inventory arborist who supported a salesperson who may or may not be an arborist. So I was also asked to write up these little summaries and some observations to put together as part of the bid package, and that sometimes helped us get some clients. Sometimes I ended up meeting with clients as well because I was the one who saw all the problems with the trees. Depending on the company, you would also be asked to write reports, especially as you get more experience or as you get promoted. The company that I worked for sometimes had some requests for construction related projects. At the time, I think maybe one person was really doing reports in that company, and he was actually a foreman, and I learned a little bit from him. That was interesting to be asked to comment on construction and to comment on things like that without having any formal training in it. Another option may be that you're working in sales as a sales arborist, and I believe this is common for a lot of beginning arborists. In these positions, whether you think of it as consulting or not, generally you are doing consulting. It's probably just unpaid consulting. So anytime a client asks you questions about the trees and you answer them, that's basically a consultation. And at some point, someone may want something written like a summary or a report, and that's the extension of the consultation. If you're bidding on tree removals, you might have to write a summary of your observations as to why that tree needs to be removed to accompany tree removal permits and things like that. So that is also consulting. If your clients need to protect trees or to write arborist reports for development and they're involved in developing properties, then you're going to be the first person they ask. The more nuanced consulting might not be what the company wants to prioritize. So if they're looking at getting as much work through tree work as possible, they may not want to invest money in training you or sending you to seminars to do this secondary service. If you find yourself in this situation, it might be helpful to remind them that some of these separate projects, they may need tree service afterwards, and that may generate more leads for the tree service side of the business. In my area, it's fairly common to be a sales arborist or an estimator and a consulting arborist at once, basically two roles in that one company. That may be because there isn't enough consulting work, but they want to be able to service both types of clients. I also find that tree service owners, they end up in these roles as well because they're usually the most experienced person in the company. Another option is to work as a trainee to do consulting under an existing consulting arborist, whether that person is working for themselves, part of a tree service, or part of a peer consulting firm. The smaller the company, the more likely it is that they would be willing to accept you with no experience, and in some cases even without arborist certification. In that second situation, if you aren't certified yet, they would probably heavily scrutinize your reports because you're writing it under their name, and that might actually turn you into a much better arborist because anything you write or anything that you say is going to be heavily reviewed by someone else. Unless you're already part of that larger company, they probably will want to see some kind of experience because they would probably want someone to be up and running and producing as soon as possible. This is a route where I got the majority of my consulting experience. Even though I started out with the first tree service where I was an inventory arborist, I don't really consider that part of my experience because I didn't get training there. I paid my own way to the Ask a Consulting Arborist, to the consulting conferences, and it was at the second tree service where I was learning more consulting under the owner of the company, who was doing both sales and consulting. And that was where I've got the actual training. I learned on the job, and I quickly took over the consulting side and even eventually trained someone else to do it. The last route that I can think of is to just jump into it after you've gotten enough experience with arborist work or learning about trees in different capacities. So you could be a city arborist, you could be a climber, maybe you're working at an arboretum or in academia. Whatever it is that has given you enough training and knowledge to be comfortable teaching people about trees, once you hit that point, people in your life will probably ask, hey, can you look at my tree and tell me what's wrong with it, what I should do? The layperson is going to see you as an expert. And that's one way to get into consulting on your own on the side if those options aren't available for you in your own job. To me, this is probably the most difficult entry route because the opportunities may not come as often as with the other options, and you probably don't have a formal mentor or someone who's training you in this unless you network and you find that person separately. This is the kind of option where if you wanted to get into consulting eventually, that you will have to seek these opportunities to learn, whether that's the Ask Academy, conferences, maybe consulting roundtables if your chapter of the ISA offers them, reading a lot of books, references, and things like that, and just putting in the practice on your own time to do it. For something like that, it's a good thing to keep your current job while you're learning the ropes of consulting, because consulting work is just not consistent, especially if you're not someone who's really experienced and someone who knows how to go out there and get clients for yourself. If you're personally interested in getting into consulting, I recommend you look up companies in your general area, seeing if there are people who are willing to talk to you. You can look at the Ask find a consulting arborist directory and see if there's anyone who would be willing to do a little bit of an informational interview, take you under their wing, maybe let you shadow them for a little while, and those are all ways that can eventually get you into a position where you get some better training.